Chapter 1. Light. One afternoon during rest time, the new boy, Frank Gold, left his bed, lowered himself into his wheelchair, and glided down the corridor. There was nobody around. It was early December, already hot, and Frank, veteran by now of hospital life, knew the nurses would be upstairs in front of their fan. The door to Sister Penny's office was closed. She'd be catching 40 winks on her couch. His first goal, as usual, was to set eyes on Elsa. He peered into girls through the crack between the hinges of the half-open door. Elsa's bed was behind the door. He liked to see her face asleep. Even if her head was turned away into the pillow, the sight of her thick gold-brown plait somehow gave him hope. But this afternoon her bed was empty. He rolled on, past the silent kitchen with its bare, scrubbed benches. Even the flies were sleeping. It was as if the whole place were under a spell, only he had escaped. He'd be waiting for this moment. In his pocket was a cigarette and a little sheaf of matches, stolen from his mother during her last visit. She'd slipped off to have a word with Sister Penny, leaving a handbag on his bed. Later, he thought of her standing at her station platform in the twilight, delving for her matches, dying for a smoke. Visits upset Ida. She didn't come every week. But the act of taking them was like reclaiming something. He was turning back into his old, sneaky self. He felt suddenly at ease, in charge again. Sneakiness was a form of privacy, and privacy here was the first loss. A resistance to the babyishness of this place, its pygmy toilets, its naps, and rules, half hospital, half nursery school, and his feeling of demotion when he was sent there. "We are so very glad to have you," Sister Penny had said firmly when the ambulance delivered him. "The younger children do look up to the older ones as examples." Frank searched her radiant face and knew there was nothing there for him to test. Everything had been resolved a long time ago. He felt like a pirate landing on an island of little maimed animals. A great wave had swept them up and dumped them here, all of them, like him, stranded, wanting to go home. Now he was gliding down the ramp of the covered way, past the new treatment block, out to the clotheslines, hidden behind a wire trellis, the only place where he wouldn't be seen. The washing had been taken in, dried stiff by lunchtime. The ceaseless rumbling and throbbing of the netting factory across the road was louder out here. It was like entering the territory of a huge caged animal. Even the white glare cheered him. Ever since the fever of polio had subsided, light had seemed less bright to him. Older, sadder. Moments of solitude were rare and must be grasped with both hands. He put the cigarette into his mouth and struck the row of flimsy matches, one after another. Sweat trickled into his eyes, his hands shook. He wanted unreasonably to curse Ida. A man's shadow blocked out the glare. A huge pair of red hands were cupping a lick of flame. "Light?" Norm Whitehouse growled. Frank inhaled. His head spun. His heart surged with love. He knew now why everyone loved Norm, the gardener, who just as silently ambled off, as if to say, a man has a right to smoke in peace. The next moment the cigarette was stubbed out on the post of the washing line and thrown across the fence. Frank thought he might be sick. Dizzy, blinded, he veered back down the dark corridor, heaving himself onto the bed. His body was not a normal boy's anymore. He wasn't a little kid either, smelling of soap, asleep like those around him. Yet after a while, as his heart slowed, a smile spread across his face. He could still hear the rumble of Norm's voice. Light? He may as well have said, life? But where was Elsa? Chapter 2. The Golden Age. Because he was so small and undeveloped for his age, Frank Gold, though nearly 13, had been admitted as a patient at the Golden Age. It was agreed, unanimously, at the IDB, Infectious Diseases branch of the Royal Perth Hospital, that it really wasn't suitable for him to stay amongst adult patients. Also, his parents were new Australians, who both worked and had no other family members to help with his care. He needed the nurturing atmosphere of the Golden Age and supervision with schoolwork. Arrangements were made almost immediately, and he was delivered there by ambulance that same afternoon. Elsa Briggs was 12 and a half, but her mother had a little baby and couldn't look after her at home. The other patients were younger, from all over the state. From Willana in the desert, from Broome up the coast, from Rawlina, a siding on the Trans-Australia line. Nowhere, it seemed, was too remote for the polio virus to find you. The Golden Age had been built as a pub at the turn of the century, in Leederville, 5 minutes' walk from the railway station, 2 stops out from the city centre. It stood alone, bounded by 4 flat roads, like an island, which in its present incarnation seemed to symbolise its apartness and natural quarantine. 3 of the roads were lined with modern suburban houses, each one drawn back behind a stretch of dry lawn, a porch and front windows sealed by Venetian blinds. Along the 4th road, the 2-storied WA wire netting factory pounded and throbbed 24 hours a day. Some considered that this wasn't a suitable location for a hospital, but the children found the noise soothing and loved the lights shining all night through their windows. The pub had been bought by the health department in 1949 and converted into the Golden Age Children's Polio Convalescent Home, to service the years of the great epidemics. Inside, with its ramps and bars and walkways, its school teacher, trained nurses and full-time physiotherapist, it was a modern treatment centre which could accommodate up to 14 children, some from the country, some who could not be cared for at home. Outside, rearing up above the dusty, treeless crossroads, it still looked like a country pub. Brick, 2-storey, the wide upstairs balcony shaded the veranda beneath. It had thick walls for coolness, long alcove windows, a sheltering iron roof like a hat pulled down low. Wheelchairs rolled easily along the wide, shadowy passageways over the polished jarrah boards. The very plainness and familiarity of its exterior seemed to proclaim its function, to give fair shelter and homely comfort, a watering hole. The name, inherited, could be considered tactless by some, even cruelly ironic. These children were impaired as no one could ever wish a child to be. But perhaps because of its former role, its solid and generous air, it was a cheerful place. The children were no longer sick, but in need of help to find their way back into the world. The staff and parents were well pleased with the Golden Age. Its rooms were spacious, cool and high-ceilinged. The children were surrounded by faces shining with hope and encouragement. Even Ida Gold, known as Princess Ida to the staff, though never slow to find fault, had to admit that she was grateful for the haven it provided. The children enjoyed the benevolence of the attention. Here, they were not a worry or a burden to make their mothers sigh with weariness. They felt different, exclusive, like a family. From the day kids who lived at home and arrived by ambulance for schoolwork and therapy, all through the morning children came and went between the schoolroom and the new treatment centre. As for Frank, he was a new boy again, working out how to be himself. He was desperate to be normal. Finding his feet, this time, meant learning how to walk. He resolved to behave well because he didn't want another expulsion. Also, in bed at night, and sometimes in the day when it was quiet, he could hear the distant whistle and hooting of the trains pulling in and out of the Leederville station, which always reassured him. Above all, he didn't want to leave Elsa. A line ran through his head, which might be the start of a poem. "Your bed was empty today, when I looked for you. Why?" Polio had taken his legs, but given him his vocation. Poet. Chapter 3. Elsa. Elsa was with Ray Macaulay in the baby's room. The thin wail had wafted across the corridor in the afternoon stillness and seeped into Elsa's head. Finally, she'd left her bed and wheeled her way to Rayma's cot. "Stop that!" she whispered to Rayma, peering through the bars of the cot. Her tone was firm. Elsa was not sentimental about babies. She couldn't remember a time when she hadn't had a younger sister to look after. The first thing to do was to stop the crying. She put a finger in her own mouth, puffed her cheeks and pulled the finger out with a pop. Rayma paused, mid-wail. Her little dark face was wet, her eyes swollen. You had to make them think of something else. "Come on," Elsa said. She lowered the bars at the side of the cot, reached across and undid Rayma's splints. By leaning onto the mattress for support, she was able to drag the little girl to her and pull her onto her lap. Hiccups jutted the tiny body. Tucking her chin over Rayma's shoulder to hold her, Elsa rolled over to the window. She lifted one of the long white curtains and pulled it around the wheelchair so that she and Raymer were screened off from the rest of the room. All their world now was the view, shaded by the veranda, the slice of empty road and the houses along it, a scene as remote to them as the other side of the world. "Look," she instructed Raymer, pointing upwards. The afternoon whiteness had taken on a steely cast. A thin, ragged cloud flitted across their view. The sea breeze must be in. During the long days in hospital, the sky passing across the high window in the isolation ward had become Elsa's backyard, her freedom, her picture show. Watched, the sky slowed itself to a silent, endless semaphore of shapes and colours, as if it were signalling a message. She was amazed at how she had neglected it in all her years free to roam, with the sun on her face, the wind past her ears. "Your mother looks at the sky and she thinks of you," she said to Raymer. She spoke firmly, looking into Raymer's bright, frightened eyes. For of course it was her mother whom Raymer cried for. It always was. In the isolation ward, Elsa had listened all day for her mother's cloppety footsteps down the corridor, hurrying in her old orthopedic shoes to find her, waving to her through the glass panel, smiling, trying not to look sad. And because the sky had become so important, the two, mother and sky, grew to be entwined in Elsa's thoughts. When she looked at the sky, she thought of her mother, and it seemed to be telling her that some of her feelings would change and never die. If her mother didn't come, the sky also told her that each person was alone and the world went on, no matter what was happening to you. When at last she left the isolation ward and her parents were allowed to sit by her bed, they looked smaller to her, aged by the terror they had suffered, old, shrunken, ill at ease. Something had happened to her which she didn't yet understand, as if she'd gone away and come back distant from everybody. Raymer had to learn to be alone. Without your mother, you had to think. It was like letting go of a hand, jumping off the high board, walking by yourself to school. Once you'd done it, you were never afraid of it again. All the kids could identify their mother's footsteps. They all longed for their mothers, except Frank Gold, who said he'd rather his father came. Sometimes even now in the Golden Age, after her mother visited, Elsa had the funny feeling there was another mother waiting for her, blurred, gentle, beautiful as an angel, with an angel's perfect understanding. Chapter 4. Cockatoos. Black cockatoos flew over the stout brick chimneys of the Golden Age as the children ate their dinners. Macaroni cheese, on trays, in their beds. They heard their cries and looked towards the windows, but could not see the large black birds swirling and dispersing over the netting factory and across the railway line. Bathed and combed, the children were content to eat in silence. Whether they came from the suburbs or the country, they knew the sound as homely, comforting, a good omen, predicting rain. The Golds heard them as they passed over the roof of their house in North Perth, 2 stops by train from the Golden Age, and a mile's walk up Fitzgerald Street. Mayer was in his tiny front yard, smoking and watering his vegetable patch. The cockatoos were heading for the park opposite, and the nuts in the pine trees. They sounded like 100 little wheels that needed oiling, Mayer thought. At the kitchen table, Ida, also smoking, thought the cries were melancholy, harsh, echoing into emptiness, an Australian sound. She and Mayer had wanted to go to America. They waited for months in Vienna to hear from a cousin of Mayer's father who'd immigrated to New York in his youth. Finally, at the end of 46, a sponsorship was offered from Western Australia. In Vienna they were living in a dormitory with only a curtain between them and 50 other people. Some had been there for years, so they accepted. When at last they landed in Fremantle, Ida wanted to get straight back onto the ship. Every day Ida found something that proved their voyage had been ill-fated. If she missed a bus, it was because they should have never have come here. Once, after a visit to see Frank, they'd sat at the kitchen table drinking brandy. Ida talked of the old days, when she used to catch the train and bribe the commandant of the work camp to give Maya a food parcel. One day in a street in Buda, dressed like an old peasant woman with a scarf across her face, holding Frank by the hand, she had come across Mayer's brother, Guri, a butcher, who was carving up the carcass of a frozen horse, surrounded by a silent waiting crowd. He told her he had word that Mayer was alive. But here they were, in a free, democratic country, and they were gutted, feeble, shell-shocked. Frank had been a resilient little fellow. He'd survived cellars, ceilings, bombing, near starvation. Then they came here. "Ida," Maya said, "polio is in every country in the world." "Play the piano," he said. She didn't answer. The reason they'd rented this little half-house was the piano in the dining room. They'd paid for the piano tuner themselves. But ever since Frank fell sick, Ida hadn't touched it. "Why, Ida?" Maya asked. He had never dreamt how much he'd missed the driven sound of Ida's scales, daily, over and over, a morning carillon. She shook her head. He knew the reason. Once, before they were engaged, flushed and heightened after her final, stunning performance at the Academy, she admitted to him, shyly, that although she was anti-religion, she sometimes believed that her gift, in its insistence, in surprisingness, came from God. Playing was a sort of conversation, she said, embarrassed. It was what was most mysterious about her, most alluring, and in her daily struggle to be equal to it, most endearing. Now she was a bird who refused to sing. "Go to bed," he said. "You are tired." But she shook her head. If she was tired, the dreams were worse. She poured herself another glass of brandy. Chapter 5. Frank's Vocation. Frank was very happy with his vocation. He'd always sensed that he had one, but he hadn't known what it was. It wasn't music, though Ida's dream had been to produce a prodigy. He hadn't inherited Maya's hand-eye coordination either. But there'd always been something that accompanied him, ever since he could remember. A secret longing. He'd felt it as a lack more than anything else. Now that he knew he was a poet, he felt stronger. His future had been restored to him. He felt adult, solid, the equal of anyone on earth. He could overcome any hardship because he had a vocation. Though, like his past in Hungary, it was something he didn't talk about. There was one reliable gap in the Golden Age routine, between dinner and lights out, into which Frank could disappear. After the trays were taken, before the splints were put on, for 20 minutes or so the patients were left to themselves. Sometimes the boys read, much-handled Spider-Man comics, Enid Blyton, Biggles, Treasure Island. Sometimes they fooled about with spitball fights. Recently Malcolm Poole had been taking himself over to Warren Barrett's bed. They had a craze for Monopoly. Lewis took out his stamp collection. It was late twilight. Sounds of laughter drifted down the stairs from the staff quarters, where the nurses were eating their dinner. Soon, in a bright swarm, they would descend on the children and leave them splintered, smoothed, kissed. The curtains drawn against the dark. At this hour, just after sunset, Frank always felt the need to go outside. It was a habit inherited from his parents. Before dinner, unless it was very cold or wet, Ida and Maya always went out onto their small front porch to smoke and drink an aperitif. Nobody said much. Maya, cigarette in one hand, glass in the other, stepped into the little front yard, checking out his plants. The streetlights came on with a blink and lit up the last home-going workers passed down Fitzgerald Street. Birds were calling out good nights as they flew over the treetops in the park. His parents had stood like this at the railing on the deck of the ship to Australia, backs turned to him, their slender drifts of smoke curling up above the horizon like the thread of their own thoughts. There was something lonely yet resolute about the way they stood there. It was not quite hope. This evening, unobserved, he left his bed and rolled silently out through the open front door along the veranda. The last streaks of pink and orange cloud were fading over the roof of the netting factory. The air smelt of warm dust, with a whiff of Norm's full-blown roses. Tiny birds hunched like a row of knots along the power lines. The first star had appeared. His poem came back to him out here. Your bed was empty today, when I looked for you. Why? He took his pencil and the half-used prescription pad out of his dressing-gown pocket. It was important to hold on to your words in the way they were given to you. Sullivan had told him that. A notebook was essential. Frank had found the prescription pad in the car park at IDB. A doctor must have dropped it. It was the perfect size for a pocket, and when he pulled it out he felt a little thrill, each blank slip waiting for its instruction, each just the right size for a poem. or the first lines of a poem, for the words of your thoughts. It occurred to him that this poem could just as easily be about Sullivan, the poet at IDB who had introduced him to his vocation. In fact, as he wrote, he realised it was for Sullivan, as perhaps all his poems were. Coming to terms with death is a necessary element in any great poem, Sullivan once said. And in this matter, Gold, he'd said, rolling his eyes towards Frank, we have an early advantage. Chapter 6. The Poet. The IDB, where Frank had first been sent for rehabilitation, was a much larger affair than the Golden Age. It had started life during a smallpox epidemic in 1893 as a tent hospital in the bushland on the outskirts of Perth. A new city cemetery was soon established, ominously close by. As the hospital grew, its wards spread out through the bush, in long blocks opening onto verandas. Frank, once he'd got the hang of a wheelchair, whizzed up and down the covered walkways that joined the blocks. He visited wards and kitchens, chased his favourite nurses, chatted to patients who sat on the verandas watching the birds dive in and out of the dark trees. In recovery, he felt a hunger to know why he was alive. Most of the polio patients were young, single adults, high-spirited survivors with a taste for sick black jokes. Frank, the youngest, carried messages, barracked at wheelchair basketball, helped set up the tricks they played daily on the nurses. Urchin thin and pale, for a short while he was their mascot, Cupid, little brother. He popped up everywhere, disarming critics in his role of the kid, with something that came easily to him, like a switch turned on inside him, which in later years he'd identified as charm. There were moments in the dappled light, the sense of waiting, the endless strangers, that took him back to being very young in the hostel for refugees in Vienna, saved, but not yet back into real life. Nobody supervised him. He was way behind in his lessons. He loved the freedom. It was as if he'd been granted a reprieve from growing up. One day, he went deeper into the old part of the hospital and pushed through the heavy doors into a ward where 4 large porthole tanks were lined up like submarines in dock. The room was filled with the sound of their ghostly, rhythmic breathing. Frank stayed very still for a minute in the doorway. Iron lungs, which did your breathing for you. Coffins you lived in. The worst thing that polio could do to you, next to death. A sweat broke out on his forehead. A ghost-like memory of confinement, of helplessness, ran through his body. He returned to his bed and lay down. But the next day, as soon as the breakfast trays had been taken, he found himself wheeling back to the iron lung ward. There was a special, serious calm to the place. It was, Frank saw, the momentary hiatus after the morning flurry of washing and feeding. A single nurse was attending to an occupant at the far end of the room. From the tank closest to the door, a head protruded, disembodied on its pillow like a head on a plate. Frank glimpsed a high white forehead, a large clean ear, a Roman nose and chin, faint acne scars around a pale jawline, the profile of a man, but on a boy's thin neck. He looked like a prefect in sixth form. "Are you going to come in?" The head spoke calmly, without turning. "Over here, so we can talk." Frank wheeled in beside him. "How did you see me?" The young man rolled his eyes upward. A rectangular mirror was poised like a tipped-up veranda roof above his head. "Move an inch back. That's it. How old are you?" "Nearly 13. "What are you doing here?" "Looking around. What are you doing?" "Writing a poem." After a moment, Frank said, "But you can't—" "I write it in my head." "What's the poem called?" "The Snowfield." "Snow? In Australia?" "It's about the ceiling, actually." "A poem about the ceiling?" Frank winced at his squeaky voice, his dumb questions. Suddenly he didn't want this role anymore. "I've got the first couple of lines." "What are they?" The poet waited, took a breath.